I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. We've got some great topics today. Inez is going to kick us off with the discussion of JD Vance's speech in Munich that led to a lot of European hand-wringing. Ben will take us through the ensuing controversy involving Margaret Brennan in 60 Minutes and some very unfortunate comments about free speech and Nazis. Will is going to address the latest peace talks in the Ukraine-Russia war and all of the moving parts there. And I will close us out with some recent actions on immigration by the DOJ, including suing sanctuary cities and also moving to drop charges against Eric Adams. So with that, Inez, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Yeah, it's as with many things in the last month, incredibly refreshing to hear JD Vance go and give this speech, relatively short, under 20 minutes, at the Munich conference in Europe. And there was an ensuing freakout, which we'll get to. But the speech itself, I thought, was excellent. And I say that perhaps as somebody who, and we can get to this later, who certainly supported Ukraine in this war, and I think people anticipated hearing more about that, and he did touch on it. But the main points that the vice president hit on were actually that the greatest threats to Europe come from within and not from without. And again, people interpreted this as a very anti-European speech, but it's interesting, which I'm okay with, frankly. But actually, I mean, he acknowledged multiple times that the U.S. was heavily involved in some of the things that he was criticizing. So I think it's more a announcement to Europe that the United States is no longer part of this cross-Atlantic sort of agreement between elites to censor domestically views with which they disagree, and also to say that if you're going to continue mass migration into Europe, if you are going to continue to censor both freedom of speech and freedom of religion. He mentioned multiple times the restrictions, for example, on prayer in front of abortion clinics in European countries, right? Pointing out that much of what has been requested of the United States on behalf of Europe, including continuing to foot the bill overwhelmingly for NATO, has been done in the name of, quote, our democracy, or in the name of democracy. And so simply pointing out to Europeans that they themselves are engaged in acts that are anti-democratic. They're not allowing their own parties sometimes who disagree with the consensus to take their rightful seats in various parliaments. He mentioned the canceled election in Romania as another instance where the, quote, our democracy people refuse to let democracy take place. And then just the censoring generally of opposing views is an anti-democratic tendency. And I specifically like the line about how, a free government, a quote unquote liberal democratic government, should not be afraid of its own people. And yet this is very much has been the attitude. Ben has talked multiple times on this program about the transatlantic censorship regime. And it looks like to me that the U.S. is pulling out of that regime aggressively and potentially moving to make it a key aspect in our relations with Europe, whether or not they pull out of that transatlantic censorship regime. Subtext on top of the things that JD Vance said, I think very much geopolitically, is that Europe is sort of not the central theater for the United States and for our national interest. And if Europe wants the United States to continue its investments in European security, then I think Europe definitely needs to be a worthwhile ally in that endeavor, which means not only meeting their spending targets, but generally being able to handle their own region of the world without the U.S. babysitting them or footing the bill. So very, very sort of tough slap in the face for a lot of people at the conference. It was very funny to me, by the way. JD Vance, of course, acknowledged the attack and the victims of the attack in Munich at the beginning of his speech, but said, I'm jokingly, I hope that's not the last time that I get applause at this conference, but it pretty much was. There were funny moments where he paused and nobody clapped, but I think people back home will be clapping. I think Americans will be clapping at this reordering of American priorities and demands that Europe actually step up as an American ally, as a useful American ally, if they want us to continue doing all the things for Europe that we have been doing since the end of World War II. So I don't know what you guys think about the speech, the content of it, the reaction. I know we're going to save Margaret Brennan and her idiocy for the next segment, but there was some European reaction as well afterwards, including crying at the Munich conference. So what do you think about all of that? What do you think about the vice president's speech?
I thought it was great, and refreshing was the perfect word for it. I mean, finally, someone standing up to what are effectively cry bullies. I mean, they take all of this American assistance, they have security guarantees from the US, and then we're supposed to stand by and just cheer them on as they violate basic civil liberties. Like, no, it's not happening anymore. Um, Amazingly, I don't know if this gets too much into what Ben's going to talk about. I hope not. But also on CBS, shortly after, they were bellyaching about this JD Vance speech. They sit down with some of the German prosecutors for the German government to ask them questions about what they do in regards to speech. And the interviewer goes, is it a crime to engage in hate speech? Is it a crime to criticize a politician? Could someone be prosecuted for that? The answers are all yes. There was a case, one of them talked about, of someone literally making fun of a German politician and having police show up at their door to seize their laptop, their phone, etc. And in this interview, the interviewer gets them to admit that actually the penalties for engaging in hate speech or insults or whatever else they decide is illegal that day, is that it's worse if you put it on the internet, because if you say it, then it doesn't stick around. But if it's on the internet, it's forever. So that's worse. And you could spend more jail time for that in Germany. I believe it's section 130 of the German legal code that lays out the various things that you could be punished for related to speech. And they say that the sentencing is a maximum of 5 years in prison, again, for making a joke, insulting a politician. In fact, you don't even have to be the one who says the joke or the insult. If you like or retweet a post, that could also land you in trouble. And they impose massive fines on social media companies that do not censor content that is considered illegal under this German speech code. So, of course, JD Vance is right to stand there and call out this absolute idiocy, massive threat to civil liberties, antithetical values to the United States. It's long overdue.
Yeah, boy do the Germans and the others deserve this. There's nothing in the Vance speech that was objectionable to normal people, but the European leadership isn't normal people. I mean, you saw there was that European leader who like cried about all this, and then other Europeans saying the United States is now an adversary, not an ally. It's like, you guys, I mean, sorry, you guys are soft, and you've been totally reliant on being under the United States security umbrella without any sort of concomitant obligation to adhere to any American values. Free speech being the most important of which. You guys want to prosecute people for insulting people on your streets? Well, I mean, we have an interest in that. We're generally not going to want to interfere or meddle in your affairs. But if this is what you guys are going to do, you're going to prosecute people for speech, then yeah, we're going to have real problems, and we're going to expect you to stop. I think JD also brought up that United Kingdom case where somebody was prosecuted for silently praying outside of an abortion clinic. That's the kind of stuff we expect from tyrannical third world countries, not our European allies. And it crystallizes that the European countries aren't particularly good allies. They don't spend a lot of money on their own defense. They rely on us to defend them, and then they reject all of our ideas, and they do things that should be repugnant to Americans. So I think it's about time that the Europeans needed to hear it, and if they want the continued benefit of the American security umbrella going forward, they don't need to be American in every way. Like, I don't care what their gun policy is, for example, but I do care that their people are able to speak freely.
It is pretty interesting. You have to imagine that the people who scream isolationist about the administration and that it doesn't care about values anywhere in the world, well, this is the administration espousing genuine Democrat, Western liberal values. And it made the Europeans' heads explode, and it clearly made heads explode on our side of the Atlantic as well from our own censorship regime, who, it bears noting, J.D. Vance also called out in the interest of comedy, in his words, in his speech. And it's worth noting, by the way, that the Munich speech follows up J.D. Vance's first overseas speech, which was on artificial intelligence. And there he also talked about the need to ensure that there weren't authoritarian censorship regimes being laundered through AI advancements, including advancements made in Europe. So the administration has spoken with a very clear voice in defending free speech robustly at home and abroad, in particular, because, of course, you have European regulatory regimes that are used as backdoors to threaten and cripple American tech companies, and by extension, to silence us based on the content moderation regime, so-called, that, for example, the EU's Digital Services Act would impose upon us via the back door. It's worth noting, I think it's important to highlight this. Vance said that he thought the biggest threat to Europe, he talked about obviously Russia and Ukraine and the implications for Europe, the need for Europe to invest in its own common defense and bear its own burdens there. But he said it's not any other external factor that he and the Trump administration view as the biggest threat to Europe. What I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America. Again, I have to imagine the people who scream isolationist, their heads must be exploding that the administration is talking about values to Europe. But of course, if Europe is going to get the American security umbrella and all the advantages of the relationship that it has with America, it ought to uphold the values that are shared values that ultimately enable our common defense. And I think it's also worth noting, Vance made a very clear, realist sort of case for you have to be responsive to your own populations or you will have no security. And the EU will erode, and it will be the EU in name only. European countries will be themselves in name only. And that goes for the open borders policies, that goes for the evisceration of free speech, that goes for annulling elections and beyond. So this was a breath of fresh air. I don't think that the Europeans ever expected to get this sort of tongue lashing in the interest of friendship from America. And again, I think people must be twisting themselves in knots who say, well, America doesn't care about the rest of the world. America doesn't care about espousing its own values. Well, here the administration came out, and in the first foreign speeches from the vice president, it did just that.
And right back to you, Ben, to talk about the ensuing meltdown that took place on CBS with Margaret Brennan. And just incredible moment. Take us through it.
Yeah, so there was almost a coordinated information operation response to J.D. Vance's remarks. First, obviously, from European dignitaries and leaders, and then to our own media, which platformed European voices, and essentially illustrated for us exactly the tyrannical policies, anti-free speech and anti-freedom at the end of the day policies that he was critiquing, including from Germany. So first to Margaret Brennan. So the setup for the Margaret Brennan interview, so-called, with Marco Rubio is, basically the administration went to Europe. It's meeting with members of the AfD and these far-right parties in Germany. And you're going out there basically talking about free speech. Well, and I'll let the transcript do the work. So Secretary Rubio says, I assure you, the United States has come under withering criticism on many occasions from many leaders in Europe, and we don't go around throwing temper tantrums about it. Brennan replies, well, this is J.D. Vance, was standing in a country where free speech was weaponized to conduct a genocide, and he met with the head of a political party that has far-right views and some historic ties to extreme groups. The context of that was changing the tone of it, and that the censorship was specifically about the right. And Rubio responds, and we can talk about the ahistorical nature of this argument, but just step back and think about what Margaret Brennan is saying. If you are if you are for free speech, you are on the side of the Nazis. And if you oppose free speech, then you are on the side of the angels. That's essentially her argument distilled. What a remarkable argument from someone who gets the benefit of the First Amendment, who's gets a privileged position based on the First Amendment as a member of the media. And she uses that platform. And by the way, corporate media itself, the biggest champions of the censorship industrial complex outside of the government, hail from corporate media. And they say basically that First Amendment equals Nazi, yet they benefit from it. And I would add also, on the one, there are many levels for why regime media is so anti-First Amendment and pro-censorship industrial complex. The cynical view of it, one of the cynical views of it is, well, by their standard, if you're going to suppress and silence the other half of the country, conservative and independent media sources, you have a monopoly on narrative, and that gives you a monopoly on power. These are also obviously the mouthpieces for our ruling elites. So if our ruling elites are saying we really need to suppress our political opposition, then of course the mouthpieces are going to go along with that as well. But then it may just be also that these are really just tyrannical people. And at the end of the day, they don't have any sort of devotion to the values and principles that created the civilization that spawned the very kind of companies that they work for. And then we can extend this and we can broaden this to what else CBS News showed on 60 Minutes that Sunday evening. So remarkably, they illustrated precisely where the anti-free speech worldview takes you when implemented. And sort of in awe, in some ways, showed you what German speech prosecutors look like, what their jobs entail. So they talk about what Germany's quote unquote hate speech laws mean in practice and as applied to the internet in this interview with several prosecutors there. And the question and answer goes something like, is it a crime to insult somebody in public? Yes. And it's a crime to insult them online as well. Yes. The fine could be even higher if you insult someone on the internet. Why? The moderator asks. And one of the prosecutors says, because on the internet, it stays there. If we're talking face to face, you insult me, I insult you. Okay, finish. But if you're in the internet, if I insult you or a politician, it sticks around forever. Prosecutors explain German law also prohibits the spread of malicious gossip, violent threats, and fake quotes. They deal with 3,500 cases per year in their office. To build their cases, investigators scour social media and use public and government data. And sometimes social media companies don't want to share it. So the task force employs special software investigators to help unmask anonymous users. This is our future if we go down the Europe path. And it was the path we were going down, by the way, of course, under the Biden administration. So then they turned to talking to the CEO of something called Hate Aid. And this is how CBS News describes it, a Berlin-based human rights organization that supports victims of online violence, which is to say words that they equate with or say are commensurate to violence. And so in response to the criticism of the anti-free speech perspective of really this human rights so-called organization, which believes in violating human rights and supports all of these asinine speech codes, the CEO says, free speech needs boundaries. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about their perspective on it. It means they don't believe in free speech. Without boundaries, a very small group of people can rely on endless freedom to say anything that they want while everyone else is scared and intimidated. And this is said on a legacy media network. And again, while CBS News doesn't go out of the way to say we endorse all of this, it's very clear that they're sort of in awe of what's taking place there. Mike Benz commented, noting that it's kind of telling that this statement, this segment, came in the same episode where 60 Minutes was tearfully crying over the need to save USAID. I think that's a point well taken as well. And then sort of this segment ends by talking about all of the EU speech regulations that are being imposed on social media companies, how social media companies are having a tough time getting on board with it. And this is in part really because Donald Trump and J.D. Vance were elected. Had that not happened, you can bet that our big tech companies would have been crushed by the regulations, would have cowed to the regulations, and it would have meant Americans' free speech would be suppressed by the imposition of European anti-speech standards on American citizens. So I think it's worth noting, this segment crystallized kind of, this is what our future would look like if we didn't have an administration, and hopefully the big tech companies working with the administration to push back on these anti-speech regimes. This is precisely what J.D. Vance was warning about. Once again, the regime media represent the biggest promoters of this censorship regime. And ultimately, the only way to win is to forcefully push back using every lever of power that we have. So thank God we have an administration that's willing to do that right now and understands the size, scope, and nature of the fight and has been laser focused on free speech from the opening executive order on ending federal censorship. Curious what your take is with regard to this just breathtaking segment and then the administration fighting for free speech at home and abroad.
Yeah, it's particularly funny because for the last week, if you have bothered to scroll over to legacy media, they have been crying about an attack on freedom of the press because they're not allowed on the Trump, they're not getting like special access to the White House or the Trump plane because they refuse to acknowledge the Gulf of America name change, which by the way, is a formal name change, even if you think it's like sort of silly and like it's a formal name change. None of them objected. For example, when schools were being renamed or military bases, they all went along with the official name. There's like very little argument for them not to do so in this case. But in any case, what they're losing is preferred and special access over other media outlets. But this is a huge attack on freedom of the press and free speech. Meanwhile, they're salivating on 60 Minutes over this German regime where they literally knock on people's doors. The joke that was going around the internet, of course, is it sounded better in the original German, right? Where they literally knock on people's doors for liking a meme. Which, by the way, has been pointed out, we came pretty close. I mean, the First Amendment is more robust in America than in most European law, but we came pretty close. I mean, we had somebody prosecuted and threatened with jail time. Hopefully, won't serve it, but for posting a meme on the internet, Ricky Vaughn, right? So in any case, like it's particularly funny that they've concluded this week of crying about freedom of the press because they're losing special access. They're not losing their right to write and say whatever they want. They're losing special access vis-a-vis other, independent media companies. And that is an attack on freedom of speech, freedom of the press. I think it goes to Ben's first point about the monopoly. And then finally, just on the specifics of what Margaret Brennan said about freedom of speech in Nazi Germany, it just highlights, credentialism is not an education. I actually have a hard time imagining even some, Soviet commissars saying something this stupid about history. So it just, and I think she really actually believed it. I think she thought it was a good point to make. And I think she felt erudite saying that. So it just goes to show that actually this echo chamber, this credentialed echo chamber, has less of a serious education than most Americans did in the 8th grade in 1950.
Yeah, it's remarkable that, early on in the administration, like Margaret Brennan got the first JD Vance interview, and people were saying, well, JD should be going out there taking interviews with conservative outlets, not rewarding Margaret Brennan. But after watching her, I have the belief that every conservative should be happy to go on Margaret Brennan as much as she wants, that she should have her book and dance card full of Trump administration appointees because she makes all of them look amazingly brilliant and intelligent in comparison to her. She is just a remarkable midwit, and her statements about free speech causing, the rise of the Nazi Party and the Holocaust are so banal and moronic as to make it very easy for literally any Trump administration appointee to look like the peak of brilliance. So congratulations, Margaret. You're doing a wonderful job for the Republican Party, and I hope you keep it up.
I love that USAID segment that Ben was talking about too, where it turns out that the person that they were shedding tears over didn't actually work for USAID. She was an external contractor who was tasked with writing speeches for Samantha Powers. Like, obviously your job is not going to exist anymore when the principal you were writing speeches for isn't at the agency. But don't worry, you're a consultant. So the thing is you get other clients and you're not actually caught up in this. But nonetheless, should we really be crying for government bureaucrats that have either not been doing their job for the past 4 years or have been actively trying to resist the new administration? No. There's turnover and layoffs in every industry. There's nothing unusual about that. But when you're getting paid by the taxpayers, you deserve, I think, an extra layer of scrutiny. And none of the media had this same empathy for the coal miners who were going to be put out of business by Joe Biden embracing the Green New Deal. In fact, those people were told that they needed to learn to code. So it's a great illustration of who the media is interested in protecting, who they actually care about. It's not you or me or the American people, certainly not the working class. We're going to transition now to Will, who is going to give us the latest on potential peace talks between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, big news this week. There was a meeting in Saudi Arabia between Secretary Rubio, Mike Waltz, the NSA, and Steve Witkoff, Trump's diplomatic envoy, first to the Middle East, but I guess he'll be used here. And that meeting was with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, meeting in Saudi Arabia bilaterally. No Ukraine present, no any European countries present to discuss improving diplomatic relations and finding an end to the war in Ukraine. It seems just in this meeting we have, sort of basic foundational steps laid to do that. They're going to try and normalize get both of their embassies up and running. I think the American embassy in Russia is not particularly active, and neither is the Russian embassy in the United States. They want to fix that. They want the embassies working and running. They want there to be a high-level diplomatic team working together to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. Focus entirely on that, and to lay the groundwork for future cooperation between the governments. I'm happy about this. Obviously, I think it's been a long time coming that the United States and Russia need to work together to end the war in Ukraine. And I really don't have much time for the complaining of European countries about the fact that this is a bilateral meeting between the United States and Russia. If they wanted a seat at the table, they shouldn't have leaned on the American taxpayer to fund the bulk of the defense of a country that far away from the United States. Since they have, it's on us. And so, the effect is that the country of Ukraine is effectively a vassal of the United States anyway. We have been funding not only their military, but also payments to their civil service, the entire functioning of their government. So yeah, guess what? It's our say whether this continues. And if I saw like Zelensky was very upset about it, and Zelensky and Europeans were like, we demand a seat at the table. And I think the view of the United States is simple. It's like, you're absolutely welcome to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine on your own terms, or to just, basically say the United States shouldn't be involved and to handle this all on your own. We would be happy to cut off all of our financial and military support to you guys so that you can be independent and sovereign and handle this on your own. But the fact is you're not able to do that. You're totally dependent on us. And as a result, the American taxpayer gets a say and the American government gets a say. And I think that it really is, I've actually been reading a decent about negotiations more generally, and that multilateral negotiations are really hard to make work. I think the best example of this was when there was a bunch of multilateral negotiations in the 70s to try and get peace in the Middle East, right? The idea was Israel needed to negotiate with Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and all of them at one, and the Palestinians and everybody at one table. And what ended up working was not this continued multilateral negotiation where anybody could veto it or anybody could throw a wrench in the works. It was when Egypt went to the Israelis, was like, we want to negotiate a bilateral peace agreement with you. And so then Israel and Egypt just sat down at the table, hashed out their differences, and got it done, right? Like Egypt got the Sinai back, Israel got peace and recognition. Voila. So here, I think it's always a good sign when you start seeing a bilateral approach to negotiations. And I think that the United States just changing from, you need to negotiate with Ukraine and make Zelensky happy. It's like, no, we are the primary partner here. We're going to make a deal. And Zelensky is going to be in a position where he has to take it or leave it. And if he didn't want to be in that position, well, guess what? You need to not be so dependent on Iran.
Look, you make peace with your enemies, not with your friends, right? And unfortunately, the facts on the ground are that Ukraine has lost a significant amount of territory, and it's not clear militarily how they would possibly restore the sovereignty of their original borders. It's just not possible. I've been open on this program. I think that, I think the moral weight for the potentially more than 1 million of people who have died in this, both on both sides, falls on Vladimir Putin and on the Russians for breaking the border, which they went well beyond the sort of incursions that they had made into primarily Russian areas. And there are some legitimate, every border has these pockets of people on both sides, right? If you go back and you look at the borders of Europe after World War II, each one of those borders pretty much was set in a way that meant that some ethnics of the state next door were drawn into the border. For example, the border between Poland and Germany on one side, Poland and Ukraine on the other, right? Those moved during the war as well. And so I think the moral, ultimately the moral burden falls on Vladimir Putin. Not that he cares about that, but foreign policy is not about what's moral and what's right. It's about the facts on the ground. And it's pretty clear that Ukraine has lost that territory. The question is what guarantees and what counter incentives the United States and Ukraine together can offer Vladimir Putin to not take the rest of Ukraine. And that's going to be the difficult part of this negotiation. Now, Donald Trump, I have become a believer in the personal negotiation style and personal foreign policy of Donald Trump. I think initially I was very skeptical of it when back in 2016, when he was sort of talking about, talking to Kim Jong-un, talking to Vladimir Putin, talking to all these guys who often seek American recognition, right, on par with negotiating with America. But I have been convinced that I was wrong about that he has been able to create deals by this sort of personal negotiation style, where on the one hand, he doesn't draw the same moral lines as sort of previous foreign policy establishment and is willing to meet and be friendly with anyone. And on the other, he has the very real big stick, right, in foreign policy that he's proven multiple times that he's willing to drop a Moab, or he's, there were reports from the last negotiations with Vladimir Putin that he said, look, like, don't piss me off too much. I might send a missile to Moscow, right? And those kinds of threats are actually credible from Donald Trump in a way that they weren't from Biden or from before him, Obama. So I hope for the best for these negotiations and looking at, what comes out of it, and hopefully at least an end to what has become a World War I style, meat grinder along Europe's borders. So a lot of young men and frankly even young women have died in this meat grinder in the last 2.5 years. So 3 years almost.
One of the side stories that I think is equally as important is the amount of money that has gone missing in the process of us funding this war. Zelensky himself has admitted that it can't all be accounted for. The Pentagon's audits of the money have been disastrous. There was a story about a year ago where Joe Biden was looking for another $10 billion to send to Ukraine, and then magically the next day the Pentagon discovered that they had undercounted funding to Ukraine by $10 billion. And so they had to send over this other check to the country. And it's just been a ridiculous boondoggle. I don't think it's unreasonable for the American people who are footing the bill here to be asking for a real accounting of where the money is going and whose hands it's ending up in. And unfortunately, because Ukraine has a lot of corruption, it hasn't been possible for us to do that. So not only do we need to have a full picture of where our funding is going, how it's being used by Ukraine, but at this point, there's been no progress in the war, so it needs to be wrapped up as well. I don't think we'll ever truly find out where all of the money went until years down the line. Maybe we find out some bad actor got it and does something awful with it. But it's a sad story all around, and it's well past time that the U.S. leadership forces both parties to the table.
I think it's clear that we sort of see the maybe broad parameters of a deal here forming, and I think the U.S. is going to be the party that ultimately clinches this deal as the most powerful player and the one that has really had, frankly, the most skin in the game with respect to the Ukrainian side of the war. So it seems like to me, as I see it, and this is based upon what Pete Hegseth said in one of his first speeches, if not his first speech overseas, to the Europeans regarding NATO, and then in some of the J.D. Vance's comments as well, that basically the U.S. needs some form of restitution for what we have invested, and that may be a substantial investment in rare earth resources and beyond, in particular in Ukraine, which, by the way, would solidify the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine further, because we literally have the skin in the game of our own investment in the place, which I think should be, sort of a counterpoint to the critics who, argue against this sort of position of, leveraging the fact that we invested all these funds in this war and we're never going to see a dime back unless there is this ongoing investment that we reap the benefits of. Beyond that, the U.S. is going to surge oil and energy, which is going to ultimately redound to the detriment of the Russian side, given that it's really oil that fuels Russia's war machine, and that's something the administration has emphasized. The EU, obviously, European countries, I should say, are going to need to step up in helping provide common defense against Russia. And that includes backing Ukraine, including with lethal weaponry, as well as financing. No NATO accession in the near term for Ukraine, which obviously is probably one of the major issues from Russia's perspective. So if you're going to get towards a negotiated peace, Ukraine is going to have to give up something that it wants, and Russia is probably going to have to give up things it wants. And we've seen there's sort of been talk of some form of land swaps in connection with territory that's been seized on both sides during the war. And then, on the carrot side that the U.S. has kind of put forth for Russia, but I think with a much broader eye here, I'll wrap with this. The U.S. has sort of talked about normalization with Russia, investments in Ukraine and investments in Russia as well. And the fact that there could be a bright future of Russia and the West coordinating, cooperating. This could be on limiting proliferation of nuclear weapons, but also obviously on more normal economic relations and cooperation. Obviously, there's going to be a fear that Russia is going to seek to exploit to its advantage that sort of position. But I think it's worth noting something that J.D. Vance said. He basically talked about the fact that Russia isn't going to want to be the junior partner to China. And I think ultimately part of what the administration wants to get to in a settlement is a new Sino-Soviet split, splitting Russia from China. And this Russia-Ukraine negotiation may well be part and parcel of that.
All right. Now to me to cover latest actions on immigration from the Department of Justice. AG Pam Bondi has officially been confirmed, and she is hitting the ground running on this issue. She has sued multiple sanctuary cities, which, for those who don't know at this point, are jurisdictions that do not cooperate with ICE. So if a illegal alien is arrested for whatever reason, ICE would lodge a detainer asking the local authorities to hold on to that person until ICE can come pick them up and begin deportation proceedings. But in a sanctuary city, they say, we don't have to honor that detainer. We're going to release this alleged criminal illegal alien back into this the city, the state, what have you, and they can go off and do whatever they want. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, these individuals end up committing other crimes. Such was the case with the Lake and Riley murder, where Jose Ibarra had been arrested multiple times, including in New York for theft, and was released before ICE could detain him, and went down to Georgia, where he then brutally raped and murdered that nursing student. So she is putting these sanctuary cities on notice, saying you cannot shield illegal aliens from federal law enforcement, from federal deportation proceedings. That is against the law. I'm going to sue you, and you're going to also, through Trump's actions, lose your federal funding. So she's not messing around with these people who are not cooperating with the mass deportation proceedings, including, more specifically, she has filed individual lawsuits against New York Governor Kathy Hochul, Attorney General Letitia James, and the Department of Motor Vehicles Commissioner in New York, Mark Schroeder, saying that they have actively chosen to protect illegal aliens over American citizens. And so they are all getting sued. She announced this in sort of a big press conference towards the end of last week. She was specifically taking aim at New York for having a green light law, which was passed in 2019. And according to the laws, quote, all New Yorkers age 16 and older can apply for a standard, not for federal purposes, non-commercial driver's license or learner's permit, regardless of their citizenship or lawful status in the United States. And she says that these documents basically allow them to skirt the law and provide protections for illegal aliens as part of this lawsuit. Now, a sort of sidebar to all of this is that the DOJ is also pushing the Southern District of New York to drop the corruption charges against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. And there's going to be a hearing today at time of recording around noon on Wednesday to determine whether or not the SDNY has to go ahead with dropping those charges at the direction of the DOJ. And the primary reason that the DOJ initially provided for why they wanted to drop these charges is that in the course of the case against Eric Adams, he does not have a security clearance. And so it's difficult for him to cooperate with the Trump administration on deportations because he basically can't access information about whereabouts of illegal aliens, criminal records, things like that. And so he's become practically useless to Tom Homan and the Trump admin. So there's a little bit of like a quid pro quo going on here. I mean, consider it, I guess, somewhat similar to a plea bargain, where if you cooperate with the state, you get some kind of lessened sentence. In this case, Eric Adams is sort of has this unspoken expectation that he has to help the Trump administration in exchange for them dropping these charges. They're also doing it without prejudice, so they could bring the charges back if he does not cooperate. But in a briefing yesterday, a senior DOJ official also argued pretty extensively that they believe the only reason this case was brought in the first place was political weaponization against Mayor Eric Adams for criticizing the Biden administration's handling of the border crisis and failing to provide New York City with resources. They described it, the senior DOJ official did, as a civics lesson for the deep state about implementing the agenda that the American people voted for, and compared the Eric Adams case to the Manhattan trial against Donald Trump in regards to the Alvin Bragg prosecution of Trump, saying that those cases are quite similar in that they were targeted for their political opinions. So we'll see what comes out of that hearing today. If the SDNY will proceed, there were several prosecutors who decided to resign because of the deal. But all of that together shows the DOJ is taking concrete actions to try to undo the Biden border crisis and use the levers of law enforcement available to them to make sure that these blue states and cities are not actively hamstringing the government's attempts to get all of these millions of illegal aliens out of the country. So with that, I'll let the group weigh in.
Yeah, I think at the time on this podcast, I called the charges against Eric Adams ticky-tack, and that's what they were. So this is a case where it was clearly selective prosecution, even though there are almost certainly real violations of the law here, right? So, but if you want to tell me that previous mayors of New York and current mayors around the country of major blue cities are not accepting flight upgrades and free hotel rooms in order that the exchange there allegedly was that Eric Adams pushed through some of the permitting process, right? So like streamlined the permitting process for some people who are giving him, free upgrades and cushy, first class flights to nice hotels around the world. I mean, this is the definition of ticky-tack stuff. And if you believe that other mayors are not doing the exact same thing and did not get prosecuted by the Biden DOJ, I don't know what to tell you about naivete and, bridges in Brooklyn and so on. This is a very endemic level of corruption in American cities. I'm not saying that it's great, although on this podcast, I've said in the past, my tolerance for graft and corruption in the city is directly proportional to how well the city is doing. If the city is doing great and the streets are safe, and people are doing all right in the city, then you get an equal amount of your hand in the cookie jar without my objection, as far as I'm concerned. But again, so this really looks like a case of selective prosecution, which in that hearing, the DOJ pointed out that this division of the Justice Department, which, by the way, has been overturned the most by the Supreme Court because they go over their skis quite frequently in prosecuting public corruption and run into the First Amendment and all kinds of other issues. But in any case, this investigation apparently ramped up, and charges were brought mere weeks after Eric Adams spoke out and started to become a political problem for the Biden administration by speaking out about the very obvious crime in New York City being caused by this wave of migrants and the financial burden on the city of housing these migrants in Roosevelt Hotel, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the case for political prosecution is pretty clear here, actually. On the other hand, it's pretty clear also that Eric Adams was doing ticky-tack graft. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the quid pro quo in all of this is that the mayor of New York City, enforces the law. that's the grand, like, sort of corrupt consequence of all of this, is that Eric Adams actually follows the immigration laws of the United States. I think that's great. And I'm not naive about the effects of the corruption. I have some thoughts on sanctuary cities as well. I think it's actually going to be quite complicated, the lawsuit. And I do think there's a 10th Amendment concern here about states directing their own resources towards enforcement of the law. But we can say that for another time when those cases go before the courts.
Yeah. I think we haven't really covered the big, I think, interesting part of this is the rebellion of the Southern District of New York against the Main Justice. And, basically, I followed this in detail. Main Justice Emile Bove sent a letter to Daniel Sassoon saying effectively, like, we're not going to criticize your decision to bring this case, but we are going to insist that you drop it. We have determined that we think that this was brought for political reasons. Also, we have determined it's not in the best interest of the United States to have the mayor unable to effectively cooperate with federal law enforcement. The reason for that being that since he's under indictment, there just can't be meaningful communication between the Department of Justice and a person under indictment without going through their attorney. And as a result, in the interests of the United States, we've deemed that this prosecution needs to end. And yet you have this rebellion from Daniel Sassoon, a nominal conservative, as well as other line prosecutors in New York being like, we don't believe you have the grounds on which to do this. And they've been getting all sorts of applause from places as varied as like MSNBC all the way to like Barry Weiss's The Free Press. And I want to say that this is actually ridiculous. There's other problems we can talk about with Barry Weiss and The Free Press, how it's like the moment that Republicans take power, their initial impulse is just gatekeep, 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 gatekeep. There are other issues there, but in particular, there is this strong urge to say, well, clearly, since Daniel Sassoon cleared for Scalia, she must be a serious conservative, and therefore that this is a principled conservative rebellion against abuses done by the Trump Department of Justice, when it couldn't be further from the truth. The line prosecutors in New York are wildly going beyond their authority. They don't get to choose who gets prosecuted. And if Main Justice, which has political accountability to the president, says the Adams prosecution ends, the Adams prosecution ends, and stop. And there's no basis for them to be like, you don't have a legitimate claim to stop this prosecution. Prosecutorial discretion rests with the executive. It does completely. So I think that, there's sort of a bigger problem here that I think maybe should explore in final thoughts. I'll maybe go into detail more there. But the idea, these prosecutors are rebelling against and being totally insubordinate for no good reason. Obviously, they have the right to resign and protest, but they actually sent letters saying, I will not file this motion to dismiss for you because you don't have the authority, which was just blatant insubordination. And none of these people should be getting jobs or appointments, rather, anytime going forward.
So on the narrow part of the sanctuary city or state or jurisdiction policies, as I understand it, this law is basically that if there's a law enforcement interaction with, so let's say, illegal aliens, and that information is discerned by the officers that they're not to share the information, essentially, or they have no obligation to share the information, essentially, with federal immigration authorities. To me, this looks like you are obstructing law enforcement actions. And obviously there is going to be, I'm sure, heated debate over the 10th Amendment. What obligations and responsibilities do state and local authorities have to cooperate and coordinate with federal authorities when it comes to immigration? But to me, you're harboring illegal aliens. If you're law enforcement and you obtain information this is an illegal alien, and then you suppress it and you prevent federal law enforcement from receiving that information. But on the broader issue, to Will's point, which is where I wanted to go as well, the president has ultimate prosecutorial discretion. It's absolutely asinine that there's a notion that there can be some rogue office like the SDNY, which says, you know what, we're just going to disagree with what the policy is that comes from your superiors. There's nothing noble about it. There's nothing virtuous about it. The whole system itself crumbles. Let's say this was the wrong decision for Main Justice on the merits and the politics. And I don't think it's the wrong decision, because I think Eric Adams was prosecuted because he took an anti-Biden administration line on immigration. He got punished with the litigation. And this is basically reversing the weaponization of the law enforcement apparatus here. But even set that aside for a moment, let's say it was a wrong decision. Still, SDNY prosecutors have a responsibility to listen to their superiors. If they don't, the entire system breaks down. That is the overarching threat to the rule of law, to separation of powers, to actually having consent of the governed by way of the president, who appoints the leadership in main justice and also all of the U.S. attorneys and beyond. So there's nothing noble about it. If these people wanted to fight what main justice declared, they should have had the conversation and debate behind closed doors. And if they weren't willing to follow orders, they should have quietly resigned, not gone to the press, not engaged in the whole Resistance Act. But the Resistance Act, where they're made media darlings, just shows you how disingenuous they are, how cynical they are, or that they really think of themselves as having wisdom well beyond their superiors and that it's their job to go ahead and do this. But that, again, that insubordination, that's the real threat to the system.
With that, we're going to move to final thoughts. And I think, Ben, you should go first.
Well, I'll just follow up on that really briefly to say this is quickly coming to a head at the Supreme Court. There's a case right now, and there's been both sides have sort of put their views forth, and it seems like we're going to find out soon from the Supreme Court on, in this case, I believe it's Besant v. Dellinger, where the Trump administration fired the special counsel, who is the chief officer at the Office of Special Counsel. There was a TRO imposed blocking that decision. So basically, you have a federal court, and it's the DC District Court judge, saying the administration can't fire this official, and we're going to freeze his act because this is an independent agency, and there's a rationale for why the president should be blocked from firing a clear subordinate. Not only is there going to be hopefully some resolution over whether an administration can appeal a TRO where one federal judge can block a president and micromanage a presidency in hiring and firing personnel decisions. But I think also there's been a lot of scuttlebutt out there suggesting that the principle of Humphrey's executor, this precedent out there, which says that there really is such a thing as an independent federal agency and that a president doesn't have discretion and power over it, including in terms of personnel, that precedent might end up overturned. So this goes back to that very same thread that we were just discussing of subordinates to the president have to be responsive to the president. If not, you have a breakdown of the system. And also this notion that that these are independent agencies, so-called, that the administrative state is essentially a fourth branch of government, doesn't have to be responsive to the president, even though the executive branch should obviously definitionally have to be responsive to the executive, who we elected, and execute the agenda that the president puts forth. Obviously, there are implications. This goes for DOJ as well. These are government employees empowered by a president to carry out the president's orders, but they're being treated as these are Elon Musk's people outside the government, who are illegitimately being tasked with doing things that the president has called for. All of this is going to come to a head, and have to hope and pray that the Supreme Court recognizes that we don't have a republic if a president can't put people in place to faithfully execute his policies, that the buck doesn't stop with the president in terms of hiring and firing decisions, and that you can't have rogue federal judges in any random district go out there and be supreme over a presidency just because they disagree ultimately with his policies and his personnel.
Yeah, to follow up on Ben's final thoughts, there's been a lot of both, I think, sort of genuine confusion and then active attempts to mislead over lines of authority here, right? And I think one of the clearest ways to talk about the DOJ line of authority in particular is to imagine what people would say if you had a so-called independent police department, right? If the chief of police was quote unquote independent from the mayor or the city council. I know different municipalities do it in different ways, right? But ultimately everyone understands the guys with guns, they need to be politically responsible to somebody that goes before the people and stands for election, right? We don't like the idea of an independent police that on their own judgment and discretion enforces the law, where there's no check from the people in an election to say, no, we don't like what the police are doing, right? So I think it becomes very clear when we bring it down to that level. I think Ben is exactly right. What we're going to see are a series of monumental and very important Supreme Court decisions on the constitutionality of the administrative state. and of the fourth branch of government. One of the things that's particularly remarkable about all this, in some sense, is that this is what conservatives have been gacking about on panels for decades. Okay. The origin of the administrative state and Wilsonian progressivism, the unconstitutionality of the way that the fourth branch operates. And we're going to have some really important decisions on the unitary executive, on the powers of the president over his own executive branch, right? On the specificity with which Congress has to exercise their powers, right? To the extent to which they can delegate lawmaking powers to bureaucrats that are then not responsible even to the president, right? So I think we're going to have some really important decisions. I would actually urge conservatives to be a little bit patient with some of these TROs. Like, they're by definition very short, and it looks like a lot of these things will be appealed very quickly. At least some of them, like the case that Ben mentioned, is going to be appealed to the Supreme Court very quickly. John Roberts is asking for briefs on it. So I think actually that we have the potential here for not just some big wins, but as I've said in previous episodes, to really reset the constitutional system of the United States, which has not been in operation now for decades because of the quote unquote independence of what ought to be bureaucrats directly responsible to the president executing law directly written by Congress. But that's not how our government has operated for decades, and it's unconstitutional. So, I mean, you would think that, folks at the Federalist Society or even in the professional right would be over the moon about this. Unfortunately, as we've seen with so many things that Donald Trump does, if Donald Trump does it, therefore it's a threat to it's scary and threatening and Nazi Germany or whatever, when in fact, all the president has done in this first month has really aggressively reasserted the constitutional system that has the president at the head of the executive branch. So I'm very excited to see a lot of these cases actually get resolved by the Supreme Court. I hope they'll be resolved in favor of our constitutional system. But this is the real chance that we have to restore something that looks like something that our founding fathers would have recognized as American governance.
I'll just quickly address this story that broke yesterday about people actively defying Trump's EOs, which has been sort of a running theme of the episode. Maine school district has been actively ignoring the executive order requiring girls' sports to be for girls only. No biological males need apply. The Maine Principals Association announced recently that it was going to continue to allow men who identify as women to compete in high school sports. And sure enough, this week, a male high school student absolutely dominated a women's pole vaulting competition in track and field, with the highest jump being at 11 feet, which I did track and field in high school. That wasn't something that girls were regularly hitting, 11 feet. No surprise there. But what I think these Maine principals need to realize is that they have just put a giant dripping red target on their back for the administration. They have threatened to pull federal funding from schools that continue to allow men to compete in women's sports. And now that they have not only said that they are going to continue to allow it, but that one of them has taken a title away from a girl who is in high school, they're going to be probably pretty high at the top of the list for who is going to be losing a lot of federal taxpayer money for choosing to defy this Trump EO.
Yeah, I guess my final thoughts are I finished up my Israel trip. I can hear my little girl in the background. I finished up my Israel trip. I finally got back after some crazy amount of travel. And there's a lot of things that I thought were refreshing and very interesting to find out, but I'll just highlight one. I think there's a lot of talk and sort of assumption that, Israel is desperately using American military aid. And I think it hits a lot. We need to be focused on ourselves. And the really interesting thing is Israeli military, we need to understand that Israeli politics isn't this uniform thing. And really there is a deep state in Israeli politics as well, especially a kind of liberal oriented leadership of the military, which is perfectly happy to keep the aid gravy train going. But there are a lot of Israeli right-wingers who would really like it if the aid went away, both because it would sort of let them be a little more self-sufficient in terms of key arms that they need, and because it would mean that future Democratic administration wouldn't have this tool to wield over them. So I think, I mean, you can be fully in support of Israel and actually still think it would be a very wise thing for military aid to be dropped. That's just one thing out of a massive trip that I had a huge amount of fun on and learned a ton about Israel, and really impactful in a lot of other ways. I actually went down and saw the Nova Music Festival grounds, and just what happened down in the South on October 7th. And I've seen a lot of impactful things in my life. I've been to Dachau, I've been to the killing fields. This blew them all away, and still even thinking about it makes me incandescently angry. So anyway, that's final thoughts on Israeli stuff.
All right, with that, on behalf of Inez, Will, and Ben, I'm Amber Duke, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.